Welcome, everyone. My name is Priya Natarajan, and I'm the current director of the Frankie program in Science and the Humanities. I'm delighted to invite you all to this evening's wonderful event as part of our Distinguished Author Series. First, I would like to start by recognizing our benefactors, Mr. and Mrs. Richard and Barbara Frankie, and their support of the Frankie program, Yale's flagship interdisciplinary program, as well as multiple other initiatives at Yale that they support. So I want to remind you that, as Ty mentioned, we have a wonderful reception upstairs after the talk. So please do stay for that. It's in the student lounge room 131. And since we are recording this talk, I'm required to read this out to you that Yale University is photographing and videotaping this event. There's a possibility that you may be included in these visuals. By being present during these activities, you consent to the use of your appearance, likeness, and voice by Yale University for standard nonprofit educational news-related promotional and/or editorial purposes. So today we're in for a real treat from one of our own distinguished faculty, Professor Beverly Gage, who is a professor of history and American studies. Her research interests lie in 20th century US history, government and political development, and ideological movements. She teaches a wide variety of extremely popular courses that focus on American politics, government, and social movements. Today she will be talking to us about her new book, G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century. This book has done incredibly well. It's completely unsurprising. If you have opened up and started even reading the first couple of pages, the writing is brilliant. The analysis is incisive. I highly recommend getting a copy if you don't already have it. So G-Man received and Beverly received the 2022 Bancroft Prize in American History and was named a Best Book of 2022 by Washington Post in their list of 10 best books, The Atlantic in their 10 best books, Publishers Weekly in their 10 best books. The list is very long, but I'll read some of them just to show you how spectacularly successful Beverly has managed to re-engage us with this very complicated man all over again. So the New Yorker in their 24 essential reads, the New York Times in their 100 notable books, and in the Smithsonian in their 10 best history books. She's also the author of The Day Wall Street Exploded, A Story of America in Its First Age of Terror, which examined the history of terrorism in the late 19th and 20th centuries, focusing on the 1920 Wall Street bombing. In addition to her teaching and research, Professor Gage writes for numerous journals and magazines, including the New Yorker, New York Times, and Washington Post. In 2009, Professor Gage received the Sarai Ribikoff Award for Teaching Excellence in Yale College. In 2015, she has a very long list of honors. I'm going to give you like a short précis because I don't want to take up, airtime. So in 2015, she was elected to serve as the first chair of Yale's Faculty of Arts and Sciences Senate. From 2017 to 2021, she served as the director of Yale's Brady Johnson Program in Grand Strategy. And in 2021, President Joe Biden nominated her to serve on the National Humanities Council, which is the advisory board for the National Endowment for the Humanities. At Yale with Professor Elizabeth Hinton, she leads the Workshop in Modern U.S. History, a monthly speaker series for faculty and graduate students to discuss the latest scholarship in 20th century U.S. history. And she's also deeply one of her own. She's a graduate of Yale University and and has a degree in American Studies and finished her PhD at Columbia in history. So without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Professor Gage. Thank you so much, Beverly, for coming today.
Well, thanks for that generous introduction. Thanks to the Frankies for their support of this program, and to all of you for turning out on a nice spring day in a windowless room at the end of the semester. So I think the plan for today is that I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes and really just try to give you an overview of this book that I published in November that is, as Priya suggested, sort of making the rounds in the world, and then leave time for some real Q&A at the end. I've found that in talking about J. Edgar Hoover, who, as you will hear, lived a very long time and did very many things that my overview is useful, but that many people come to this subject from many different directions and many different interests and have many different points of intersection. So I want to make sure that we get to the things that interest you about Hoover as well as the things that interest me. When most Americans think about Hoover in the 21st century, one of two images comes to mind. The first, and I think most prominent, is of Hoover as sort of the great villain of the 20th century, someone who abused Americans' civil liberties, was one of the most manipulative, powerful, and most hated figures in all of Washington. The second and slightly more prurient set of images that often come to mind, they're really more a product of the 1990s, are a set of questions about Hoover's sexuality, his private life, most prominently the story that emerged in the 1990s that Hoover liked to wear women's clothing. So I'm going to get to both aspects of that part of his image as we go through the talk and as I did in the book itself. But to start, I wanted to present a different image. This is Hoover's funeral in May of 1972. He was the first civil servant ever to lie in state at the U.S. Capitol. And there are a couple of things that I think are important about starting with this image. First is that by the time he died, he had been in office as director of the FBI for 48 years, so almost half a century. This is a cartoon that I reprint in the book, and I highly recommend picking up a copy of the book, even if you don't buy it, because I managed to persuade my publisher to publish 130 photos, which was a little bit of a struggle, but I'm going to show some of them here today, but there are a lot of good ones in there. This is one of them, and this is a cartoon that was done in 1968 when Richard Nixon was elected president that shows all of the different presidents that Hoover had served under, from Calvin Coolidge to Richard Nixon. Hoover became head of this little organization known as the Bureau of Investigation in 1924 under Calvin Coolidge, as you can see there. He stayed on through the presidency of Herbert Hoover, so that was into the dawn of the Great Depression, the crises of the late 1920s and early 1930s. He then remained for all 3+ terms of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. This is Roosevelt seated. Hoover is the kind of youngish man standing right behind him. That's Roosevelt signing some crime legislation. So he stayed on through the New Deal, the lead up to the Second World War and all of the Second World War. He was then there through both terms of Harry Truman's presidency, so that's the dawn of the Cold War, the years of McCarthyism. He then stayed on through both terms of Dwight Eisenhower's presidency, so the tail end of McCarthyism, the conservative as well as liberal politics of the 1950s. They stayed on through John Kennedy's presidency. He was there under Lyndon Johnson through many of the dramatic changes and crises of the 1960s. And then he remained under Richard Nixon and died toward the end of Nixon's first term, still with the same job, the head of the FBI. So when I have told people over the last decade plus that it took me to write this book, that I'm writing a biography of J. Edgar Hoover, often their first question is, why in the world would you want to do that? And I think often what people mean by that question is, why would you want to spend so much time with this villain, with this terrible man who is reputed to have, and in fact did, so many terrible things? And one piece of that answer is simply this sweep of time, that Hoover was there for so long doing so many different things that he's not only interesting in his own right as an individual, but is interesting to me as a vehicle into some larger story about 20th century American politics, and I think tells us some things that aren't as evident when we look in other places. So I just want to mention a few of those things and a few of those big themes that I tried to emphasize in this book, and then I'm going to run pretty efficiently, I think, through the book as a whole, and then open this up for Q&A. So one thing that I think that we can see when we look at Hoover as a vehicle for thinking about the 20th century, rather than some other ways of thinking about our politics, is a story that's as much about government as it is about politics. My book is called G-Man, which stands for Government Man. And it's called that because that was the nickname for FBI agents beginning in the 1930s. So it's a catchy title in that sense, but it also conveys one of these big themes that I try to get across, which is that this is a story that is about politics, but it's about governance, and in particular, it's about the growth of the state, the federal government, over the course of the 20th century. When Hoover became director of the FBI in 1924, it was this little organization known as the Bureau of Investigation. There were a few hundred agents. They didn't actually have a whole lot to do. By the time he died in 1972, he had about 16,000 employees. The FBI's jurisdiction had expanded dramatically, and the size of the federal government as a whole had expanded really dramatically. I think when we look at our political history, very often, certainly in public discourse, to some degree in the historical profession as well, there tends to be a lot of emphasis on political parties, political figures, elections, ideology, and Hoover's part of that story. But he sort of turns our lens toward the administrative state, toward this vast world of executive power and administrative power that really operates outside of electoral control in many ways, and that in some ways becomes, I think, the bigger story of the 20th century, or at least one of the most significant political stories there. And within that, Hoover is a really interesting character. He is someone who was really interesting to me as an ideological figure because I think he represents two strains of our political story that we don't often see combined very well together. One is that he was, from his earliest years, really a true believer in this vision of federal power, in what we might describe as a kind of progressive or liberal vision of state power that involved professionalism, that involved nonpartisan service, that involved career service to the government, that involved the use of science and expertise to serve the public good. And on the other hand, he was, throughout this whole time, a really deep ideological conservative on questions of race, on questions of religion, on questions of law and order, and above all, on anti-communism, which is really the big theme of Hoover's life. And I think, what fascinated me about his story, and what we don't see very often, I think, in our own politics today, is the combining of these two traditions into a career that lasted for a very, very long time. In the book, I characterize him as something called a conservative state builder, but someone who essentially used the tools of the liberal state, including the New Deal, which is really the moment that the FBI gets his power, but used those tools really to serve a variety of conservative causes in the end, and made those two pieces work together. So that's sort of the political puzzle of the book. And then, of course, one of the other things that drew me to Hoover was simply the opportunity to reinterpret a figure that actually hadn't been revisited in a very long time. There were about 30 years have passed since the last round of Hoover biographies. And even when I started working on this book, which was, I will admit, in 2009, about 13 years ago, even then it was clear not only that Hoover was in many ways ripe for reinterpretation, but that there were a whole host of new files that had come out about Hoover. And it seemed like an opportunity to delve into those. In particular, files that had come out since the end of the Cold War that I think really help us to rethink some of the ways that we narrate the struggles over communism and anti-communism in the 20th century, but lots of other files that have come out as well, some of them through the Freedom of Information Act, some of them files that I myself acquired through the Freedom of Information Act, others that were released in a routine way by the FBI. So I am, in my core, really a kind of archive nerd, a history nerd. I love sitting there with these giant piles of files, trying to figure out things that we didn't know before. And I will say the amount of information available about a figure like Hoover is both part of the appeal of writing this book, which I will warn those of you who haven't seen it, is about 800 pages long. And of course, is one of the big challenges of doing it. How do you not read absolutely everything, but read enough to find out things that are really new and interesting? And of course, in Hoover's case, that basic problem of expansive but limited research is complicated by the fact that he ran a very, very secretive bureaucracy. And so many of those files are, even today, 51 years after his death, are still redacted, are hard to access, are hard to figure out. So I'd be happy to talk more about that research project as it evolved over the period that I worked on it when we get to the Q&A. But all told, those variety of factors, the political puzzle that's available, Hoover as a vehicle into so many different things over the course of the 20th century, and then the wealth of new material that was available made me think that this was a good moment to revisit this figure that I think has been and still is a household name, but who has been a pretty one-dimensional figure in lots of ways. And my goal in writing a biography of him was not only to intervene in this set of academic conversations, but to really sort of take him from where he's been, which is this one-dimensional figure sort of seen as this rogue actor in American history, and really bring him back into a more complicated story about the 20th century, and really bring him back into the center of things and to the center of a political story about this period of time. Because while we tend to think of him as someone that everyone loves to hate, there are very few people in our own day and age who want to claim a figure like Hoover. Nonetheless, during his lifetime, he was enormously popular, he was enormously influential, and of course, any one of those presidents, all 8 of them, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, could have fired him at any moment and did not. And so the story of his longevity, his popularity, the sources of his support is also a piece of his story that I wanted to tell in this book. And I think in many ways, maybe the most counterintuitive piece of that story, given how widely hated and condemned he is in our own day. So I wanted to take a few minutes now and just put a little more detail onto this story of Hoover, run relatively quickly through the sections of the book so you can get a sense of the kind of amazing scope of his life, the variety of things that I touch upon in the book. And then, as I said, hopefully we can just open this up for conversation. So this is a real birth to death biography. I found that in writing a biography, one of the advantages of the biographical form is that it does give you a place to start and a place to end. And that's what I have done. I did not try to upend the biographical form. And these are some of the earliest pictures we have of Hoover. I should note this is the only actual photo of Hoover doing what? Wearing a dress, his baby photo. But Hoover is a child of Washington, D.C. He was born in Washington, D.C. in 1895, and he never left. He's born there in 1895. He dies there in 1972. And his biography really is a story about Washington, D.C., what that city meant and how it changed over the course of his lifetime. And during his early years, I think there are two themes that are really important for his future development. The first is that he was born into a world of government service. He was born on Capitol Hill, just a few blocks behind the U.S. Capitol. And he was born into a family that already in the late 19th century had decades of service to the federal government in the sort of professionalized end of the executive branch in the few places that really were part of the federal civil service at that point. Right? The government in the late 19th century, particularly the executive branch, is much, much smaller and has many fewer duties than what we are accustomed to today. But nonetheless, Hoover's family had been involved in the government, and it was the world that he was born into. His father was sort of a mid-level civil servant, and it was what Hoover saw all around him. Washington, D.C., as the national capital and as the federal city during those years also meant some very particular things. The most notable of which is that Washington, D.C. residents could not vote. They did not join political parties, and they could not vote either for their own municipal government or in federal elections. So Hoover was not only born into this tradition of civil service, but he was born into a world that stood sort of proudly apart from partisanship, that was a world of career service and in which he had very little access to any sort of democratic participation. So he never saw his parents vote. He himself never joined a political party, and he never voted in a single election. So that's one piece of the Washington tradition that I think is really critical for understanding where he came from and who he became. The other piece that's really critical is that he was born into Washington that was essentially a conservative southern city in the late 19th century. It was a city that was actively undergoing a process of racial segregation, had been a pretty multiracial city in the mid and late 19th century, but during his childhood was actively building racial barriers. And he participated in and witnessed and was shaped by that process. He went to segregated public schools in Washington, D.C., and then he went on to a segregated private university, George Washington University. At the moment that he joined federal employment under the Wilson administration was precisely the moment that the federal government was self-consciously and actively segregating federal employment throughout the executive branch. So these two pieces, this government service tradition, a tradition of racial conservatism, of active segregationist processes, go on to be really important to Hoover as he develops over time. As I said, he went to the Washington, D.C. public schools. He does not come from a wealthy family, so he goes through the public school system. This is him here as a high school cadet. He was a kind of star student. We, I think, tend to think of him as a rather plodding and, fixed old man, but he was apparently quite the energetic, vibrant, and ambitious young student in high school. He was the valedictorian of his class. He was the cadet leader of his high school class, and he was also a star debater in high school. He, from there, went on to a really critical period of his life, which is his years as a student at George Washington University, that matter for, I would say, three key reasons. Number one is that in order to earn his way through law school at GW, which was an undergraduate degree then, he had to have a day job GW at that point was basically a night school for future federal civil servants. And most of them had government jobs by day and then went to GW at night. Hoover was one of those students. He got a job at the Library of Congress, helping to sort through and establish the Library of Congress classification system. And he learned very early on there to build files, to learn to classify things, a whole set of kind of administrative and information technology tools that prove important. The second is GW is his introduction to the study of the law. And then the third is what you see up here, which is that at GW he joined a fraternity called Kappa Alpha. Kappa Alpha became not only important to him as a young man at GW, but became the source of much of his hiring at the FBI in the years to follow. Now, Kappa Alpha is a really fascinating institution, something that I didn't know much about, hadn't been written about much before this biography, but it turns out that Kappa Alpha was a explicitly Southern fraternity, had been founded in 1865 in the wake of the Civil War, essentially to carry on the lost cause of the white South. Revered Robert E. Lee, had very explicit sort of racialized lost cause pro-Confederate politics, and by the time Hoover joined in the early 20th century was a real meeting place of power for segregationist Southern Democrats serving in Washington, D.C. So Kappa Alpha becomes a place where you can see that Hoover's racial ideology is hardening, really becoming much more specific, and it's also a place where he begins to develop a political network that becomes incredibly important to him, a world of Southern Democrats and a world of access to political power. These images are a couple of examples of Kappa Alpha, which he remained involved in for all of his life. The first one up there, which is a novel called The Klansman, which became the basis for the film Birth of a Nation, written by a guy named Thomas Dixon, who is one of the most famous Kappa Alphas of Hoover's era. He was still alive, was this sort of famous segregationist voice. And of course, both The Klansman and The Birth of a Nation are glorifications of the Ku Klux Klan. Birth of a Nation came out while Hoover was a college student. His Kappa Alpha fraternity gets together. They screen it. They're very tightly tied into the world of the Wilson administration, where that kind of politics is holding sway. And this continues for much of his life. As I said, he retains a kind of lifelong allegiance to and alliance with Kappa Alpha, draws a lot of the first generation of FBI officials, both out of GW and Kappa Alpha. But as you can see, this is an image from the 1950s when Kappa Alpha is really critical in popularizing the Confederate flag as a symbol of resistance to the civil rights movement, and then over there, a kind of lifetime achievement certificate for Hoover in the early 60s from Kappa Alpha. I should note that they are still around, this fraternity. Many of these issues are still live issues for Kappa Alpha, so I recommend Googling Kappa Alpha in our own present day. I should also say they are not thrilled with my depiction of them in this book. I have heard from some Kappa Alphas on those sorts of questions. So that is his really important, I think, formative period in college, 1913 to 1917. And then something happens that's really important and is one of these kind of flukes of timing that matters not only for Hoover, but really for the nation, for the 20th century, for the United States, which is that he happens to graduate from college in 1917 at exactly the moment that the United States is entering the First World War. He does not, though he had been, a cadet captain, does not go on to serve in the military. Instead, he moves straight into the Justice Department. It is his first job out of college, and he never leaves. So he spends 48 years as head of the FBI. Ultimately, he spends a total of 55 years as an employee of the Justice Department, beginning in 1917. He moves into the Justice Department at another really critical period in American history, a period in which the Justice Department's duties are expanding very dramatically with the war, and in which they have a deep need for sort of energetic young lawyers to help them figure out how to manage those new duties. Things like draft enforcement, as the U.S. is engaged in large-scale selective service and draft for the first time in many ways. There are a whole new set of speech laws that come in during the war, the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, aimed at war dissenters, left-wingers, revolutionaries. The Justice Department has to figure out what to do there. And they are also given the task of figuring out a system of internment for German nationals living in the United States. And that is actually Hoover's first set of duties at the Justice Department: German internment and German registration during the war. Again, something that goes on to matter an awful lot from the moment that he enters the federal government. He is charged with these new experiments in figuring out, who's dangerous, who's not dangerous, who belongs, who doesn't belong, whose opinion is acceptable, whose opinion is not acceptable, and how are you going to use this new legal and administrative state that is in the works to police those lines. These are some early archival examples of his judgments as a young lawyer about various German cases. Turns out that he is so good at that at the age of 24, as the war comes to an end, and these questions of what all of this new apparatus is going to look like and do with the war, he gets the first big promotion of his life, the thing that really brings him into the Bureau of Investigation. And that is a promotion to the head of something called the Radical Division within the Justice Department and the Bureau of Investigation. It's really the federal government's first peacetime experiment in how to conduct surveillance of left-wing radicals in the United States, particularly anarchists and communists. World War I had also, of course, produced the Bolshevik Revolution, had produced a whole new set of concerns around the globe about revolutionary sentiment, the rise of communism, and in the United States helps to produce a pretty dramatic Red Scare beginning in 1919. Hoover is in the thick of that. He is, as a very, very young man, one of the architects of the Palmer raids, which are a series of deportation raids aimed at anarchists and communists that take place in late 1919 and 1920. He spent a lot of the rest of his career denying that he had ever been involved in the Palmer raids because they became very controversial and sort of notorious symbols of civil liberties abuses. But it's clear from the archival record that he was deeply involved, that he helped to plan those raids, and that he learned quite a lot very quickly during those early years. One is really an introduction to the language and set of ideas that become the cause of his life, which is the struggle against communism. He's initiated into that very early on as a young man. He writes some of the first official briefs for the federal government about the nature of the new communist parties forming in the United States. He really stakes a lot of his career and being one of the great government experts on communism. And he's saying very similar things in the 1940s. He's saying very similar things in the 1970s to what he first starts to articulate in 19 and 1920 during these very early years. And then the second piece is it's the moment that he first comes into contact and then conflict with new civil liberties organizations that are just getting their start and that he's going to kind of be in a dance with for the rest of his career, most notably the ACLU, which has its origins in the First World War, these struggles during the Red Scare. From there, despite the controversies of the Palmer raids, Hoover does get another quick promotion in 1921. As the Democrats leave power, the Republicans come in. Hoover manages to stay on and gets a promotion to become assistant director of the Bureau of Investigation at the age of 26. And then in 1924, 3 years later, at the ripe old age of 29, becomes the director of the Bureau of Investigation, which is the job that he holds for the rest of his life. So I've spent a long time on Hoover's early years, and I'm going to move a little more quickly through the next sections of the book so that we can get to the Q&A. But I think you can see during these early years a lot of the themes developing that he is going to then learn to build upon, to operationalize over the course of his career at the head of the Bureau. And I think one of the puzzles and interesting aspects of a figure like Hoover is that on the one hand, he has a very fixed set of ideas about government, about race, about communism, about religion that are there from the moment he begins this work to the moment that he dies. They're incredibly consistent, right? His words sound incredibly similar over the course of that period. And at the same time, he is someone who is incredibly adaptable, able to learn, and in particular, able to respond to and build upon crises. And in many ways, the story of the 20th century is a story of various crises that then produce big shifts in the government, growth of the security state, as well as the social welfare state. And Hoover is incredibly skilled at adapting to those crises and delivering on what he thinks the people above him, particularly in the White House, as well as those below him, his popular constituency, want from him, from the FBI, and from the federal government as a whole in those moments of crisis. So the first part of the book really focuses on his early years from 1895 to 1924, kind of getting him to the moment of becoming head of the Bureau. Part two then moves into looking at the 1920s and 1930s as the periods when he really built the institution that we know as the FBI. It is very strange for us to think about, but when Hoover came in 1924 as this young new director of the Bureau, he really is brought in as a reformer. He's brought in as a kind of energetic young reformer, trained in the law, trained in information technology, trained in a certain kind of professionalism. And his job is to professionalize and clean up the Bureau, which has been A, kind of tiny backwater, but B, a mess even at that, full of corruption, notorious for its abuses of civil liberties. And so when Hoover comes in, the word is there's a new man in town. He is a young professional steeped in progressive ideas about science, about expertise, about education, and really his vision when he becomes head of the Bureau is to remake it as a kind of elite law enforcement agency that is going to be a model of these progressive era ideas about facts and science and expertise and education within the world of law enforcement. As you can see here, merit. Often he's contrasted with figures like Sherlock Holmes, the kind of rogue detective, right? And Hoover's men are going to be a different kind of professional agent. He promises not to do lots of things, says they are unsuited to the work of something like the FBI. They're never going to open people's mail. They're never going to wiretap. They're never going to coerce anyone into doing anything. Of course, this changes a little bit over time, as you will see. And he sets about not only kind of as he would describe it, cleansing the bureaucracy, but bringing in a new generation of college-educated lawyers and accountants who are supposed to be these kind of shining, white-collar, professional law enforcement symbols. Many of them come straight out of his beloved institutions, both George Washington University and Kappa Alpha. This is a newspaper feature on the many young GW men who are remaking the Bureau in the 20s and 30s. The most important of those men is this fellow here named Clyde Tolson. Clyde Tolson was a graduate of GW. He graduated a few years after Hoover, entered the Bureau in 1928, and went on very quickly to rise to the number 2 position at the Bureau and to occupy that position at Hoover's right hand for the rest of his life as well. Now, Clyde Tolson, of course, if you know anything about J. Edgar Hoover, is not just the associate director of the FBI, but is it also in many ways Hoover's life partner, his social partner, and the closest thing that Hoover ever had to a spouse. There are lots of, I think, interesting things to say about Hoover's sexuality, and I'm happy to talk more about that. I do write quite a lot about it in the book, but I'll just say a few things right now. One is that Tolson is by far the most important relationship in his life. Hoover does not get married. He does not have children, but he and Tolson really relate to each other as a social couple in the way that you might expect that spouses would. They not only work together, they have all of their meals together, they vacation together, they socialize together, and they're pretty widely accepted in Washington, New York, Florida, California, the places that they spend their time together as a social couple. So there are lots of nice scenes in the book of, Hoover and Clyde double dating with, say, Dick and Pat Nixon. And so Hoover's life, his private life, his social life, his intimate life is, I would say, a funny combination of, on the one hand, being very, very public and open, and then, of course, having lots of secrets as well. I'll show you a little bit about Hoover and Tolson. So this is one of my favorite pictures of them together. This is a celebration of Tolson's 20 years at the FBI. I think it was his 20th. It might have been his 15th, but one of Tolson's anniversaries at the FBI. And what I like about this is not only that they're wearing matching suits and standing in a sea of flowers, but it looks kind of like a wedding photo, right? But that's the closest we have to that. I think the more interesting photos, and one of the places that I really tried to access not only their public life together, which, as I said, is very open, right? I mean, there are Broadway shows and nightclubs and vacations and all over the place together, the horse track, the baseball game, but a little bit more of their interiority. What did any of this mean to them? One of the best sources for that was Hoover's private photo album. I've reproduced some of those photos there, but that photo album is really filled with fairly intimate portraits, particularly in the 30s and 40s, of their vacations together in places like Miami and California. So here's a shot, presumably taken by Tolson of Hoover at the beach. Getting dressed. This is Tolson on a fishing boat, a photo taken by Hoover. And there are dozens and dozens of these photos, really quite intimate photos of the two of them together. And there are other ways to I think, begin to get at what they meant to each other. But these are some of my favorite sources. Of course, then in thinking about Hoover and Tolson as a couple, there are a couple of complications. One, we don't know, of course, whether this was in fact a sexual relationship or not. Two is that they came of age and were deeply interested in and involved in policing the sex lives of other gay people, particularly in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, when it was federal policy that you could not be gay and be employed in the federal government. So Hoover is on the one hand involved in this very public, open, intimate social partnership with his number two at the FBI, and then on the other hand is actively policing the sexual and private lives of thousands of federal civil servants. And to complicate matters further, of course, when anyone suggested, as many, many people did over the course of Hoover's life, that perhaps Hoover himself was gay or queer or homosexual, right, in the language of the time, they might actually get an FBI agent showing up to their door, knocking on it and saying, we've heard you've been spreading these rumors about the director of the FBI. We're sure you don't want to say such scurrilous things about the most wonderful, important federal servant we've ever seen. And of course, people were a little frightened in those situations. But he really used the power of the bureau that he created to police his own reputation and to police the boundaries of what was known about his own intimate life. So I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. That relationship plays a big role in the book, but I want to say a few other things about what happens in the 30s and 40s as Hoover is the head of the FBI. And probably the most surprising thing is that it is really during the New Deal that he ends up acquiring most of his power and influence. He spends a lot of the 20s and 30s kind of engaged in building up the scientific end of the Bureau, the fingerprint division, getting control of crime statistics, right? When you hear crime statistics today, that's because J. Edgar Hoover in the 30s demanded that the FBI be in control of crime statistics. So if you hear the FBI uniform crime reports today, that comes from Hoover's years, setting up the FBI lab, setting up its academy, setting up these new training facilities to professionalize the Bureau. During the 1920s, these are the glamour shots of the FBI that Hoover likes to promote. There are sort of endless numbers of shots of just filing cabinets, right? Guys standing at filing cabinets, showing off how much they know, that they are, white collar paper pushers, etc. But this is the Hoover's favored image of the Bureau in the 1920s. And then suddenly, in the mid-1930s, that all begins to change. By 1935 and 1936, you're not seeing filing cabinets, but you're seeing the famous images of FBI agents with Tommy guns as great crime fighters. The main thing that happens in the 1930s to produce the FBI that we know today is that Franklin Roosevelt and the state builders of the New Deal look to the FBI to become the sort of federal standard bearers for what they describe as a war on crime in the 1930s. So suddenly Hoover's nice white-collar lawyers and accountants are told, beginning in 1934 and 35, that they are actually going to be gun-wielding policemen. Some of them have no idea how to shoot a gun. They had no expectation that this was going to be their job, but in the midst of a New Deal push, to go after a wave of kind of high-profile kidnappers, bank robbers, figures like John Dillinger. You see a radical change at the FBI, and that's where we begin to get this very different image, and Hoover responds to that crisis quickly. That happens through crime legislation, and as you can see through some of these images, the FBI becomes essentially a New Deal alphabet agency, right? They become symbols of these new forms of federal power that are going to intervene not only in solving the economic pressures and problems of the New Deal, but are going to be much more involved in law enforcement as well. So here they are fighting kidnapping. Along the way, Hoover begins to develop what become becomes one of his signature features as a bureaucrat, which is his public relations division. Encouraged by Franklin Roosevelt, who says, you can't just accept that people understand the work of government. You've got to sell it to them. You've got to explain to them what the federal government is doing. Hoover becomes really a master of publicity. Hollywood movies, newspaper reports, etc., begin to glorify him and really turn him into a celebrity in the 1930s. And then the last thing that happens in the 1930s and into the 40s is that the FBI moves much more aggressively into the world of domestic intelligence, espionage, in ways that are fundamentally new. And it's under Franklin Roosevelt that the FBI really begins to do the work that we associate with it today. On the one hand, to be a federal criminal law enforcement agency, and on the other hand, to be our domestic intelligence agency, dealing with things like espionage, and in particular with political intelligence, surveillance, and kind of mass political surveillance. The other thing that happens by the end of the war is that the FBI has quadrupled in size. So Hoover started out in the 1920s with this tiny little group of a few hundred agents, a few hundred people in the fingerprint division. This is his filing cabinets by the end of the war. This is the Washington Armory. The FBI moves in, and as you can see, he now, by the end of the war, really has an army of his own. So that is part 2 of the book, this period of institution building that moves from the 20s through the 40s. I'll just say a few words about the last 2 sections of the book, which I think in many ways are the periods that most people today know best when they think about Hoover, when they think about the FBI and its history. The first of those is the period in the late 40s and into the 1950s, when I would say Hoover has finished a lot of building the FBI and then puts it to work for the causes that he cares about most, and above all, puts them to work in the cause of fighting communism. They've been doing some of that work in the 40s during the war, but as the war comes to an end, the Cold War begins to emerge. Hoover very quickly becomes one of the most prominent voices of anti-communism in the United States. This is the cover of Newsweek by 1947, already looking to Hoover as a national spokesman for the anti-communist cause and really for trying to raise the level of alarm in the United States around the question of communism. I think there are a couple of things that are worth noting about the way that Hoover relates to this question and why he's really important. As I said, in the 20s, 30s, through the war, he's really building the Bureau. He is not doing, I think, as much following of his own agenda as we begin to see during this period when he's really secured the institutional heft of the FBI, has secured his own public profile, and then can really begin to shape public opinion and to shape Washington politics in much more autonomous ways. It is possible to imagine an FBI director in the 1940s, faced with the emerging Cold War, who takes a pretty narrow view of national security, right? Says that I am a federal law enforcement agent and the head of our domestic political police. But in that role, my job is to look into questions of espionage, perhaps to keep an eye on the Communist Party, which is, in fact, cooperating with Soviet agents during these years, both around espionage, and is taking money from the Soviet Union. And that's where my job ends, right? That's what a national security and law enforcement profile looks like. Hoover sort of does the opposite. He does that kind of work, and there's lots of interesting stuff to say about the big espionage cases of those years, but he makes himself a kind of cultural icon, a political force in defining the struggle against communism in the broadest ways possible. So to Hoover, it is not only a matter of espionage or of containing the role of the Communist Party, but he really frames anti-communism as an existential struggle that involves every person in the United States, and that is constantly being fought out in every institution in the United States, from universities to public schools to churches to the government itself, and that involves every aspect of people's lives, from race relations to religion to family structure, and on and on. And so he's engaged in a lot of very kind of technical investigations on the one hand, and then on the other hand, he is pouring out a whole series of books, articles, films, framing the communist question in very dramatic and, as I said, sort of existential ways. Couple of other things to note about this period. One is that it's a period when he begins to work very closely with congressional committees, especially committees like the House Committee on Un-American Activities, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, congressional committees that are involved in the kind of work that he cares about. One of my favorite chapters in the book is about his starting in the 1940s, as a variety of these committees need professional staff, to agree to start staffing them with FBI agents. And so he gets this very dramatic inroad into Congress. The Appropriations Committee, HUAC, a whole series of committees end up staffed by FBI agents, which means he has access to lots of information, lots of influence, and lots of important ties to Congress. Just one symbol of his bureaucratic skill. This is Hoover testifying in front of Congress in 1953 in the Harry Dexter White spy case. The other is his relationship to Joseph McCarthy. So this is a photo of a vacation photo with Hoover and Tolson. Let's see, Hoover's over here on my left. Tolson is the second one from the right there, and that's Joe McCarthy on the end. So they're all vacationing together out in California. In some ways, they are social friends. They obviously share a set of anti-communist commitments. But what was more interesting to me were the ways in which Hoover and McCarthy ultimately diverge. Hoover becomes seen popularly in the White House, as well as among liberals, as the more responsible alternative to Joe McCarthy, who ends up depicted as the kind of demagogue, the loose cannon, the liar. So in our minds, I think these two are often kind of conflated together, but in the politics of their moment, they were seen as very different sorts of figures. And in fact, it's Hoover that many liberals end up rallying behind as sort of an alternative to Joe McCarthy. I'll just show a few examples as well of Hoover's broader cultural impact. So this is, a bus bench. I think it's in Houston. Is that what it says up there? At any rate, I said that Hoover was not only this kind of technocrat, but this significant popular and cultural figure. This is him fighting communism. He wrote a bestseller called Masters of Deceit that many people were forced to read as young children, telling you how you could participate in the fight against communism. This is Hoover lecturing American families about how to raise their children, which, people would occasionally point out they're not sure where he gets his expertise on that question. And then finally, in the 50s, as I said, Hoover's this important cultural figure on anti-communism, but he also becomes a very sort of outspoken religious voice and plays a big role in the kind of surge of religiosity that's so important to the conservative politics of the 1950s. All right, I will finish up very quickly just with the period of the 60s and 70s, which, as I said, I think are the most familiar to many people today, and really are the period when Hoover becomes, if not a less influential figure, a less universally popular figure. By the late 1950s, his popularity ratings are in the 70s, 80s, 90 percentiles. That begins to fall off a little bit in the 1960s as the country's politics change and as he ages. So the last part of the book is this period from 1960 up to his death in 1972 that covers what I think are three of the most interesting presidential relationships in the book. The first is his relationship with the Kennedy administration. And what I love about this picture is that I think it sort of captures that relationship, which it was not a happy one. They really didn't like each other. And John Kennedy is one of those figures who might have fired Hoover. He certainly thought about it. He considered it and thought that it was not a good idea for a variety of reasons. Hoover was particularly hostile to Bobby Kennedy, who, of course, was made Attorney General under his brother's presidency at a fairly young age. I found myself actually surprisingly sympathetic to Hoover, who is in his early 60s, that is saying, why is there this 35-year-old Attorney General? He doesn't seem very qualified, and I don't really like him. But at any rate, theirs is an interesting relationship as well. It then goes on to Hoover's relationship with Lyndon Johnson. And I think we would tend to think of Hoover and Johnson as being on opposite sides of things like civil rights, other major political trends of the 1960s. Johnson as a great liberal icon, Hoover increasingly seen as a far-right conservative, but actually they got along really well and they cooperated in pretty dramatic and often quite outrageous ways in the 1960s. They had been neighbors on the same block in Washington, so they knew each other from the 1940s onward. And it's really Lyndon Johnson that we can thank or blame for making J. Edgar Hoover essentially FBI director for life. Had things gone their normal course, Hoover would have been forced to retire at the age of 70. That would have been January 1st, 1965. But Lyndon Johnson decided to exempt him from the mandatory federal retirement age. And this is the ceremony in 1964 where Johnson says that he wants Hoover to stay on. Now, why did Johnson want Hoover to stay on? It's an interesting question, but as I said, they had this long-standing relationship, and also Johnson went on to use Hoover and the FBI more aggressively than almost any other president. Sometimes that was in the service of civil rights enforcement. Johnson really pushed the FBI to be more aggressive about civil rights enforcement, particularly after the civil rights legislation of that era. But he also used the FBI pretty aggressively to police the civil rights movement, to police the left. One of the more outrageous moments is when Johnson asks the FBI to conduct surveillance, wiretapping, infiltration of civil rights demonstrators at the 1964 Democratic National Convention on his behalf, and to report back to him what was going on there with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. At any rate, there's a lot about Hoover and Johnson. It's a really interesting, complicated, and I think counterintuitive relationship in many ways. And there's a lot about Richard Nixon as well, which is probably the most long-standing and closest presidential relationship of Hoover's life. They too had been very close since the 1940s. This is them vacationing together as well in the 1950s. But they run into some conflicts when Nixon becomes president. And theirs is an interesting and complicated relationship as well. That section of the book also goes into a lot of the big investigations of the era, most notably the Kennedy assassination and the King assassination. I should say, in writing the book, there were a few sections that I really dreaded having to get into. Those were among them because the volume of material related to those cases is so vast. The literature related to those cases is so vast, and so much of it is so bizarre and terrible, and I had to wade into that. But the real thrust of this final section is about Hoover's political policing in the 1960s, particularly the FBI's campaigns against the civil rights movement, against the New Left, and against figures like Martin Luther King. in which the FBI conducted not only a pretty aggressive public campaign to discredit King and destabilize the movement, but also a whole series of pretty outrageous secret activities, including wiretapping King's home and office phones, planting bugs in his hotel rooms to record his sex life, sending those recordings to King along with anonymous threatening notes, and deploying those sorts of tactics not only against King, but against a wide variety of figures on the left, as well as to some degree on the right as well. Probably the most famous of those programs in the 1960s is a program known as COINTELPRO, which was started in the late 50s as a program aimed at the Communist Party, expanded over the course of the 1960s to become a program of surveillance and disruption aimed at nearly every organization on the left, from the civil rights movement to the Black Panthers to student activists. It was a program that involved not only surveillance, wiretapping, etc., but active disruptive techniques, sending in informants to disrupt meetings, planting false newspaper allegations, working with local police to set up activists for arrest, etc. It's worth noting here that most of this was aimed at the politics of the left, but the FBI did employ some of those techniques against the Ku Klux Klan, against neo-Nazi organizations, white supremacist organizations in the 1960s. So I think even in this period, Hoover has a more complicated story than is often portrayed in the public discourse, although the basic thrust of COINTELPRO as a pretty destructive, outrageous, and illegal program that had a dramatic effect on the civil rights movement in particular, but the New Left more broadly, I think is basically correct. And then we end up back here in 1972 with Hoover's Funeral. As I said, he sort of died with his boots on as FBI director in May of 1972. And at the moment that he died, there was a lot of celebration among those who hated him. But I would say more broadly, reflection on the fact that whatever you thought of what he had accomplished, he had been really a central figure in the politics of the 20th century, a central figure in the politics of Washington over that time period. And as Richard Nixon said in his eulogy for Hoover, one of the giants of American history. And so my goal in writing this book was to sort of take him from what I think he had become in the 21st century, which is sort of a one-dimensional caricature, and bring him back into the center of this politics, where he had his hands in so much, but where he wasn't just acting on his own. He was acting in concert with many figures in the White House, with many figures in Congress, and was an enormously kind of popular and influential public servant, for better or for worse. So I will leave my remarks there. I'm happy to, take questions in whatever form you think makes sense, Ty.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all,
Thank you.
wonderful talk on a great subject. I just finished rereading 1984. COINTELPRO, by the way, is a great newspeak word. First to me, right? Maybe that wasn't lost on Hoover. And of course, Orwell is preoccupied with the idea that technological advancements would be developed and employed in the surveillance and the advancement of surveillance of individual citizens, and like the telescreens in that novel. So you talked a bit about Hoover's ideas on science, which you described as progressive. What were they? Can you give us a brief history of what they were, and how did they figure into what became his modes for surveillance and his work at the FBI?
Yeah, great. That's a really important question, and it's a big theme of his career. So when he became director in the 1920s, he advertised himself as kind of one of the great expositors of something called scientific policing. And scientific policing was supposed to make police more effective and, as Hoover would have described it, less brutal at the same time. So, what scientific policing really meant was a couple of things. One was harnessing a new set of social science tools that could be put to the work of law enforcement. So, that was everything from new classification and filing systems to things like fingerprints, which are just coming in as a form of identification, to crime statistics, right? There was no, I mean, in the 1920s, early 30s, there's a lot of talk about this as a crisis in the United States, but there were no national crime statistics being gathered in any effective way. So you had perceptions of growing forms of crime. You have new things like the automobile and the machine gun coming in as tools that are allowing first greater degrees of violence in some ways, but are allowing criminals to cross federal lines, cross state lines. And so there are all sorts of technological changes that are then driving this push for crime statistics. So Hoover is very serious about wanting to get control of crime statistics because he saw it as one of these places where the FBI could be effective as a rather small organization. It could be in touch with every police department in the country in order to collect these statistics, and so that was going to be important for his kind of institutional influence. And then it was going to allow him to influence and define what crime was, how it was counted, as well as what public perceptions would be. So scientific policing is, on the one hand, this set of kind of professionalizing and social science tools that includes the FBI Academy. And then on the other hand, there's this whole world of forensic science that is just starting to open up. So fingerprints fit over there as well a little bit. But one of his signature developments in the early 30s is the FBI Crime Lab, which is still the FBI Crime Lab that we know today, which has had its own sort of failures and scandals over the last 20 years. But his vision was that he was going to employ, a bunch of chemists and scientists who would be able to be the nation's top forensic experts, so that when local police ran into problems, they could send their evidence into the FBI. The FBI could help them to figure out what was going on, and they would get that information back down to the local police level. Because, of course, in our country, to this day, almost all law enforcement is done at the local level. And so to be a federal law enforcement agency, or even a federal intelligence agency, but in law enforcement in particular, Hoover always had this problem, which is that relative to the scope of the country, the FBI was tiny, and that it didn't have actually a lot of jurisdiction, or it had very weird areas of jurisdiction. And that is still true today. And so he saw these not only as places of kind of scientific progress, but he also saw them as sort of strategic points of intervention, a role that the Bureau could play. And I think it's still a really important part of the FBI's image, this kind of, how many television shows do we still have that are about, kind of elite forensics labs that are often at the federal level, that are doing the work that Hoover envisioned.
Did Hoover seem to run off the rails in the 60s? And do you think that the student protests had anything to do with that?
Yeah, the 60s were definitely the period in which I think what he had built up in the 50s, which was very bipartisan support and very widespread public support, really begins to fracture. And a lot of it has to do with his attitudes toward and public campaigns against student activists, the civil rights movement, right? I think he took a lot of what he had done, both in terms of formal techniques and in terms of publicity with the Communist Party in the 50s, and kind of transferred that over to the New Left and to the social movements of the 60s. But of course, the Communist Party wasn't very popular in the 1950s, whereas those movements actually had real popular constituencies, a lot of people who supported them, and so his formula suddenly didn't work in the 1960s. So some of that, I think, was generational, right? He was getting much older. He seemed much more sort of out of touch with the new generations of students. Some of it was that he sort of couldn't get out of a sort of Cold War mentality. So he's constantly accusing Martin Luther King of being a communist, accusing student activists of being tools of the communists, right, the anti-war movement. And it didn't work as well in the 60s. And then I think there was also just a sort of changing civil liberties consciousness in that decade, where techniques that were once deemed, tolerable or acceptable, you were really seeing a different set of assessments about individual rights, about civil liberties. And so a lot of Hoover's techniques as well also came under a lot more scrutiny.
I was going to ask, what sources gave you, it sounds like he was a very political person. And I'm wondering where you felt like you got the most frank and honest access to his voice and his thinking and his mind in correspondence or anything else.
Well, I think there are a couple of different things that come to mind. So one is, are the FBI files themselves, which, as I said, have all sorts of problems, right? They're police files, and so they have certain, obvious biases, et cetera. They also are often redacted, so you can't find out everything that's in them. My personal favorite file on that front is the FBI's file on the CIA, which, has page after page where they say, dear director, the most interesting thing happened today, and then it's all just black, right? So you can't actually have access to any page after page of redaction. But the advantage of those FBI files is that during Hoover's lifetime, he believed that no one else would ever have access. There was no Freedom of Information Act. There were no congressional intelligence committees. And in fact, there was no mechanism aside from the courts, which occasionally forced the FBI to cough something up. Hoover believed he had total control over those files. And therefore, they're pretty candid in these files, both about, when you read their files on Martin Luther King and what they're plotting against him, and they just write it all down. And that's true in many, many instances. And then Hoover himself had a habit of writing things in the margins. So he had a blue pen. He could write things in the margins. And so he's just scrawling all of these often, kind of epithets and his true opinions of many people. So those I actually think are pretty direct access. And then the most direct and literal access to his voice are the Johnson and Nixon tapes, which are really interesting because he had very close relationships with both of them. Lots of their phone conversations are recorded and you can listen to them. And they are talking about a vast array of things. And and they're often pretty frank with each other in those.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with the organization that's called The Family. That there's been a lot written about it over the years, and they claim to have Supreme Court justices and senators. In your research, did you find any connection between Hoover and the family?
I didn't find direct connections, and I'm generally familiar with the family without knowing all of the specifics. But Hoover's relationship with the right and with right-wing organizations and with, a certain kind of nascent religious right that's beginning to emerge during his lifetime was really interesting to me. Though a lot of the kind of conservative movement that starts in the 50s and into the 60s kind of takes aim at federal bureaucrats, right, as the worst people in the world, is anti-statist in lots of ways, right, a kind of Buckleyite critique of the federal government. Hoover was always the one federal servant, lifetime career bureaucrat that they loved. And one of the places that this emerges pretty dramatically is with the John Birch Society, right, which in many ways is kind of a forerunner of the of the sorts of organizations that you're talking about. John Birch Society, far right, kind of grassroots anti-communist organization in the late 50s and early 60s. And the John Birch Society loves Hoover, right? They are constantly assigning his books. They're sort of saying, the great authority, J. Edgar Hoover says, the communist menace is here and it will never go away and we all have to participate in this. But Hoover himself was actually pretty skeptical of groups like the John Birch Society because he thought they were extremist. They were a little out of control. And so there's a real ambivalence there. So, I think that would be sort of his relationship with an organization like the family. The only other thing that I would say is that Hoover was himself, I think he considered himself a kind of deeply religious Christian. He didn't go to church all that often, from what I can tell, but he spoke often, particularly in the 1950s, about the need for religiosity. He had, send all your children to Sunday school. He had been a Sunday school teacher. And I think institutionally, he then begins to bring a lot of that into the FBI. So he begins to hire Mormons in much greater numbers and Catholics in much greater numbers in the 50s and 60s. And he begins to bring a set of kind of religious rituals, communion breakfasts, prayer breakfasts into the FBI itself. So there are ways in which he's doing some of that similar kind of work within the Bureau itself.
So it sounds like with the religious part of his life, lukewarm as maybe it was, there's that dichotomy again between what he is portraying or what he's advocating for, right, and what he's really living. Same thing with If I Had a Son, was that the book? Looking at his photo album and his writings, the marginalia that you surely pored over for years, what is your sense of where he was mentally with that dichotomy? Is it this is self-aggrandizement for career advancement, or he was skillful enough to occupy both spheres and do it, to his bureaucratic success? How did he square that?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure I found the final answer to that question. Right. There is one of my favorite discoveries that helped me get a little sense of that, maybe, is that in 1950, he was on vacation with Clyde Tolson in Los Angeles, and a reporter started following them around. They didn't see the reporter, but they went to the farmer's market together, they went and got ice cream cones together, and then they went to a bookstore, and this reporter was following them, and the reporter looked at the books that they were buying, and Tolson was buying a couple of Westerns, beach reading, but Hoover was buying 2 books by a psychoanalyst named Karen Horney, who was a famous psychoanalyst of that period, wrote popular books. Her papers are actually here at Yale. And one was called Our Inner Conflicts, and the other was called Self-Analysis. And so I was like, I'm going to read these books. And, the Yale libraries being what they are, there were Karen Horney's books. And so in particular, Our Inner Conflicts was about precisely what you're saying, what it does when your public image is so radically different from the self that you know, and what that does to someone to have that kind of radical difference. You're one thing in public, you're another thing in private, and you have to live with that. And the premise of that book was that it produced a certain kind of grandiosity, a certain sort of rigidity, and a kind of hyper-policing of your public image and of those around you, right? A heightened need for control, etc. And it was kind of remarkable. So I don't know if we can take this and therefore apply it directly to Hoover, although there were a lot of features of that did resonate with who he was. But what was interesting to me is that it seemed that he himself was actually trying to sort out that question, right, in ways that he couldn't speak about publicly. Maybe he spoke about with friends. Maybe it had to do with his sexuality. I mean, some of it must have had to do with his sexuality. But there were other aspects of his life where that applied as well. So all I can say is that, there are glimmers that he was asking those questions, even if they never quite got reconciled.
I think it's fascinating that the concept of the deep state is living with us and become new, and it seems like that his role in creating what now people think of as the deep state was so. Or what do you think about his sort of ongoing legacy, or both with the nation and with the right?
Yeah. So one of the things that's been really fascinating to me over the last 5 years, really during the Trump era, is to see a kind of dramatic reversal in what we got really from the end of Hoover's life up until fairly recently, which is politics in which, in the wake of Hoover's death and then the Church Committee investigations of the 1970s, which were investigations into the FBI, the CIA, that really produced some of the knowledge we have about all of their abuses over the course of the 20th century. Right? In that moment, coming out of the 1960s, you had a pretty consistent set of political sentiments in which Democrats, liberals, and leftists were much more critical of the FBI in particular than Republicans and conservatives, right? Republicans and conservatives tended to love the FBI. Democrats, liberals, progressives, be very suspicious of it. And today that has flipped very dramatically. And some of that simply has to do with, the Trump era investigations themselves. I think has to do with, a broader sense that the part of the FBI that is in fact about, fact finding and expertise and law enforcement is itself worth protecting in a period when, facts seem to be up for debate. But so now we have, as you're saying, a situation in which, a lot of the most vocal deep state critiques are coming from the right. And I think you can see a little bit of that during Hoover's years. I mean, particularly among white supremacist groups in the white South, there was always a lot of resistance to federal authority, to the FBI. And so I think you can see some of those strains coming out now. And of course, there's always been a sort of libertarian critique of the security state, of federal surveillance, the deep state. But yeah, it seems very consistent now. There's no question Hoover is an architect of that, and some of that politics come out of his era. James Comey blurbed the book, read the book, and is someone that I've had a few conversations with over the years about Hoover, and both looking at him from the outside and then just speaking with him a little bit about these issues. I do think that the FBI has also often been in a very difficult position where it's situated in the executive branch. It is supposed to be nonpartisan, fact-finding, right outside of politics. And yet again and again in its history, it gets dragged into these incredibly politicized investigations, incredibly partisan situations where it's legitimately quite difficult to figure out what to do, right? Hoover had that experience quite often, especially in the 60s around the major assassinations, later on for the FBI around Watergate. And I think you can see exactly that structural tension at play right now. And it so happens that, it's playing out in a very particular partisan way at the moment. But yes, defund the FBI is not coming from the left in this moment, right? It is a right-wing slogan.
He was in power, you said, for 48 years. How do you think he maintained that power so consistently? And number two is, you mentioned President Kennedy wanting to maybe fire him. Why do you think he did not?
Well, I think those questions are related to each other. And I think the easy answer, and probably the most popular answer to how Hoover stayed in power for so long, was that he had the goods on people, right? That he had files on lots of important people in the media, in politics, in the White House and Congress. And there is some truth to that. And it's certainly the case with John Kennedy, that the FBI knew an awful lot about Kennedy's sex life. They knew an awful lot about, kind of overt action decisions that the Kennedys had made. They knew, for instance, that John Kennedy shared a girlfriend with the head of the Chicago mob, right? So pretty compromising stuff. And Kennedy knew that the FBI knew that. And so, I think that's at least part of the story, particularly in Hoover's later years when he has such a concentration of power. But one of the things that I wanted to really bring out in the book is that I don't think you can understand his power simply as this form of coercion, because he had lots of support as well over the course of his career, and he was incredibly skilled at building that support. So the main reason that many presidents didn't fire him is that he was really, really useful to them, right? He would do their bidding. He would keep their secrets. He was occasionally, resistant in ways that they didn't appreciate, but often was incredibly accommodating to White House wanted done. So he had control over his bureaucracy. He did what presidents wanted, and they saw value in him. But he was also really good at creating a popular constituency. The FBI built up relationships with organizations like the American Legion, Daughters of the American Revolution, and they sort of, anytime anyone critiqued the FBI, every American Legion post would sort of rise up in protest about our great heroic FBI director. So he was very good at that. He had a huge amount of energy devoted to public relations and to press relations in particular. So had lots of columnists in his pocket who would also rise to his defense. And as I suggested in talking about congressional committees, he was really smart about building a series of kind of mutually beneficial relationships with congressmen and senators in particular, a lot of whom really liked him and really supported him. So to go back to Kennedy, but I think this is indicative of his power more broadly. Kennedy did not like him personally. They didn't get along that well, but Kennedy knew that Hoover had a lot of information, the ability to get that information out. And Kennedy also says that he actually thinks that J. Edgar Hoover is A, more popular, and B, has a more loyal political constituency than Kennedy himself does. And so, they thought Hoover was more powerful, more popular, and not a place to waste a lot of political capital.
Okay, and with that, another round